And this is a welcome to anyone who is joining us watching the recording of this, mentor teams for the students who are presenting, or any other students who are checking out this recording later to look at these presentations. Welcome. We have 5 presentations today, and looking forward to these. Nate Partee is going to get us started here with his. Nate, it's yours.
All right. Is it sharing?
It is.
Cool. Cool. All right. Hello, everybody. I am doing my first one on the core course community. And I'm a Methodist, and there's a very popular Methodist quote. So I'll just go to read it all so we all know. But my idea was, what is community? And I used this quote as a beginner. John Wesley in 1739 says, solitary religion is not to be found in the gospel of Christ. Holy solidarities is a phrase no more consistent with the gospel than holy adulterers. The gospel of Christ knows of no religion but social, no holiness but social holiness. That is a very strong statement. And so that's what I kind of wanted to explore with what is no holiness but social holiness. And to just real quick, so we don't have to talk about what holiness is, for him, holiness was fullness of love or love excluding sin. So we're not going to talk about holiness as much as talking about the social aspect of holiness. My thesis is that actually to be holiness and relationships are irreducibly relational. I use a threefold aspect to argue this, that God's sanctifying grace draws us into connection with God, God's people, and God's world. Taken together, this is constitutive of the holy life itself. It's not just assisting us in the holy life. And so that is the claim I'm making, that John Wesley, and I use my research methodology to kind of show this, is narrative autoethnography with constructive theological interpretation. This is a qualitative research methodology. I'm going to take my lived experience of a spiritual wilderness, so something apart from holiness, into dialectical conversation with Wesleyan's accounts of holiness. The spiritual wilderness, it kind of works because for John Wesley, another aspect of holiness is that it restores us to God's image. And so we have fallen from God's image and we need to be restored in that image. And that is wholeness. And so holiness for him would also kind of be wholeness in our vernacular today. So with that, this is kind of the way. So autoethnography, for those who don't know, is almost just like storytelling. It is talking about the my own personal experiences and how they relate to how I experience the research topic itself. And so about 2 years ago, I read a quote by John Wesley in the Wilderness State. It says, "Is not your dryness and barrenness of soul occasioned by your heart's departing from the living God?" Essentially, what he's saying here is, I don't know if you all heard of the dark night of the soul, but he is actively arguing against that and says that actually there is no such thing as a positive dark night of the soul. That if you are in darkness, that is a symptom of either sin of commission, omission, whatever. There's a problem. It's a symptom, not a methodology that God uses to bring us to holiness. And so when I read this, I was actually a full-time pastor for about 4 years, and I was not doing well. I was very much emotionally and spiritually disconnected from God, even though I was connected to God's people and God's world. So what I did was, this is the story part, right? This is how we tell the story, is I quit full-time ministry because I'm an extreme guy. And if I wasn't connected to God, I was just going to quit and I was going to connect to God. And I spent 2 years trying to connect to God in this kind of sabbatical type of way. What I discovered was after 6 months, I never felt further from God or a sense of wholeness in my life. And so I returned to church after about 6 months of this sabbatical. I started attending Sunday school again and worship. I became talking with people in our community. And so God's people started to connect with me again. And I felt a little bit better. So I was connected to God and God's people. However, there was something missing. I needed to connect to God's world. And so this meant for me returning to vocation. I started teaching again and I started preaching. And this is where I found wholeness. And I've been a bear here about 6 months now, and it's been feeling pretty great. Maybe I'm done with holiness entirely, but probably not. but this is kind of the way I discovered what social holiness was for me. Um, the constructive theological interpretation, I use Manfred Marquard's understanding of God's saving grace connects us to Christ with one another and with the world. Obviously, I use connecting our lives with God instead of Christ, but that's a dealer's choice. This is kind of just my lit review. Connection to God. We have the order of salvation, the Christ and atonement, and the dark night of the soul. Because even though John Wesley disagreed with them, I think he wasn't as generous as he could have been. And I do think that they still have something to say about our spiritual life connecting to God. And so, but that's not community. So let's jump into the community aspect. For John Wesley, there were Methodist societies that held people accountable in spiritual formation. These were intense gatherings of 5 or 7 people, and they would ask questions like, "Is there a secret you don't want to reveal right now? Now is the time to share it." Like it was intensely intimate and vulnerable. And John Wesley said that these are vital for the path. But they were not the church. Methodist societies were different from the church, which is word and sacrament and worship, which is also important for our holiness. And then this is another asterisk, Trinitarian love. John Wesley actually would say that there is a different love that we have for God's people that we have for the rest of the world. He calls it a peculiar love of our brothers and sisters in Christ that is fundamentally different than the love of all of mankind. That's a fascinating idea. I touch on it, but I would love to continue that. I did not continue on that because I have to go to God's world. God's world is kind of this is where social ethics comes in, works of mercy and justice. We also have taking care of our creation, so stewardship of creation, and then just a general posture towards the world. I would say that this is almost like the right affections we have for people. This is hospitality, openness, the I thou relation I use. So this is kind of connected to how I saw my story, and this is the theological interpretation of it. You can see all these writers if you so desire. I was told a while ago that if I'm going to teach something, I better be able to make a graph out of it to help people understand. So this is the graph that explains the 2 other slides. We start with conversion, our new life in Christ, and then we are connected to God alone. So we just have that one little thing before it splits off. Just because John Wesley actually believes that we are first connected to God and then connected to others, I would tend to agree. And so first we're connected to God, and then as necessity to be whole, to be entirely sanctified in holiness, we need to be connected to God's people and God's world. And that's why it's a threefold aspect, is that we need to be connected to all 3 of these things in a dialectical way, not just only connected to God or only connected to God's people. But if we are apart from one of these, we will feel a wilderness state. We will feel that there's something wrong going on. So as I said, we are going to be studying, or I'm going to be, the research methodology is auto ethnography. And some of the trade-offs with this style, it is a very qualitative methodology instead of a quantitative. This allows a great amount of depth. I can reveal to y'all the interior life of me, the all the situations that were going on. We can really dive into the particulars of an individual. However, that is a weakness, is that it's not universalized. So the particularity of it actually does, I think, hurt the methodology. Um, Interiority versus bias. So yes, as I said, we can talk about my emotions, my feelings, my desires, what was going on in my inner life in a way that other styles cannot really get to. However, there's a major bias, as I could just be wrong or I can see things incorrectly. And so that is very important to acknowledge. Reflexivity versus contamination. The reflexive part is actually really great because I can have an event like I did 2 years ago and spend months studying it, thinking about it, reading about how other people interpret it. And that is a major plus for the methodology. However, as we know, memories can be false. Narratives almost have to lie a little bit to tell the truth. And so when we do a narrative style, or even just think about memories again, we do lose some kind of that what actually happened. So that reflexivity can actually hurt too. And then lastly, the context. I am a very specific person, a very specific place, and that is very difficult to transfer to other people. And so it kind of works particularity also, but that is kind of the weaknesses. But the ultimate weakness is that it is a self-report. So I was going to do a self-reported survey, but that was just impossible. And for one of the reasons was that, and I use Kierkegaard here because he's my boy, is that we can be in despair or a state of sin or spiritlessness and not know it. And so the major challenge with a methodology like this is I can actually just be totally wrong about my own feelings of holiness or feelings of what is going on in my life, and y'all wouldn't really have any idea, right? Because you can be ignorant, you can be in despair, not to will to be oneself, and not really know it. However, this is the great part about that is that all of these things they kind of really circle in the individual. And this is the beauty of actually what we're doing right now is that through autoethnography, we are able to talk about it. Y'all can have a discussion about my own inner life. Y'all can hold me accountable in this research. This is the meta-ness of what's so beautiful about social holiness is that the gospel of Christ knows no religion but social, no holiness but social holiness, because I cannot do this journey by myself. I might have a great story. I might be able to argue it with all these ideas and people who agree with me already. But the fact that I have to open up to other people and have them speak to my life, is actually a vital part of what it means for holiness to even exist. Holiness is not solitary. It is lived with God, God's people, and God's world. Finn.
Thanks, Nate.
Thank
That
you,
was
Nate. Yeah.
full speed, straight on. One of the things that I I really, in some case, miss or regret about the way we structure these things is that in order to process as many as students as we need to do so at one time, we don't really have time for live interactions, which is why we do it on the feedback form. Because at this point, I would just like to spend the next hour and unpack Dark Night of the Soul, Wesleyan sanctification, Trinitarianism, all of this, and autoethnography, which I think you may
Oh,
be what?
just I struggled so much with that word. I don't know why it just. But sorry, you were saying what about it?
Yeah, it's okay. The emphasis is on the third syllable, or however you say it. But yeah, autoethnography, which is a fascinating research method. I think you're the first student that I can at least recall that has used that in one of these research projects. So I was delighted to see it. One of my colleagues at a former institution kind of wrote the definitive book on this and introduced it to me, 20 years ago or so. So I'm glad to see that. So thank you for that, for stimulating our thinking and giving us a high energy presentation to begin with. And Nate, you can now relax. You're done and enjoy giving feedback to our colleagues. Esteban, do I remember you said you were going to go?
Yes.
Second. Okay. I will, while you're setting up, I will get your feedback form, which, by the way, I email these also to each of you who are presenting your own feedback form so that you don't have to go looking for it someplace else or worry about it while you're presenting. But first I have to get it and post it here. As I may have just alluded at the beginning, Esteban is a longtime senior academic and a scholar already. And so he probably
Thank
has
you.
some very useful feedback for the rest of us in this process too. And I appreciate his humility, but let's tap into his wisdom while he's with us too. Thank you, Esteban.
Thank you for the opportunity. Yes. So in this research proposal, I'm working on the main research question about the initial church perception of mission in a decolonial sense. And I'm going to start with that research question, which is, what does the initial church perceive mission in a decolonial sense? And I'm concentrating on the initial church until the 300, until the church became somehow imperial. So I have some secondary research question, like how did the early Christian practice resist imperial domination during those 300 years? How the marginalized community shape Christian mission? And I'm using Paul Ricoeur hermeneutic, how Ricoeur hermeneutic illuminate liberatory aspect of mission. So that's the primary research question, and these are the secondary research questions. So I'm looking at this research through two lenses, through the Paul Ricoeur hermeneutics and through the decolonial theory. So in a way to summarize, Ricoeur hermeneutic is suspicion, retrieval, narrative identity, and refiguration. And to summarize the decolonial perspective is paying attention to the marginalized voices, critique of domination, and liberation. So this is the two lenses that I'm using for this research proposal. So the purpose then is to interpret how early Christian community conceptualized mission. I'm not interested in how mission is understood today or how mission was understood, 200 years ago. I'm interested in how that initial church from the 40 until 300 understood mission. And the significance of this could be also that we can have a narrative that is not shaped by coloniality and that is centered around that community, living. The way I'm doing the lit review or the literature review, I'm looking at the historical context, and these are the primary historian expert on that time that I'm looking at. I'm looking at the communal practice again of those first 300, and look how Justo Gonzalez and Andrew McGowan present that. The decolonial lenses, I'm using Enrique Dussel and Gustavo Gutierrez, Elsa Tames, has helped me understand how that church lived during that time in front of this imperial government. I'm paying attention to those voices that were not heard, so I see how Chuslet Fiorenza and Musa Dube and Fernando Segovia chose those voices. And the primary sources that I'm looking at is the Didache, the Shepherd of Hermas, Ignatius, and Polycarp. Those that that tell us a little bit about how those initial group live church. They're not the only one, but I'm talking about the primary ones. I'm looking at what they say that that initial mission was about caring for the sick. It was, communal identity. It was about, there was not temple, there was not place to meet, but they meet at work, they meet at the field, they meet at church, close to the river. And the implication of the fact that there was not temple, and that how they welcome the strangers and the poor, and how they deal with death and the burial. What I'm looking at also, see those gap in what are those marginalized voices that we have not paying attention? What were the imperial assumption, which sometimes mission is often read through the idea of conquer and that colonization, and not just looking at the text, but also some other art and burial domestic space on archaeological findings that they chose how they were living during that time. And what the martyrdom and suffering as a way to how were they resisting, this colonization. Like Nate, I'm coming from a qualitative hermeneutic design, like Nate from the constructive epistemology. See that and decolonial theoretical lessons, and I'm concentrating on Paul Ricoeur hermeneutics. That's the one that I'm using that. So I'm using textual sources like the Didache, non-textual sources with the archaeological findings on burial practice, domestic worship, and secondary scholarship, this historian that I'm telling you, these theologians and the hermeneutics from that perspective to, one, understand the social and political context and look at how mission was lived there, not much preach, but live, how they live that mission, and dialogue with decolonial voices regarding power, identity, and recovery. Like Nate, so in order to protect the credibility of the study and the trustworthiness, so I will concentrate on reflexivity and bracketing, so being aware of my own biases that I will have on this one, and trying to have the coherence between the research question, the methodology that I'm using, the way I'm using the sources, and this is not the ethical commitment, so I'm not working with human subject, just this data, but I will do it in a way that is respectful as well and not to reproduce any kind of domination. And that's it. Thank you. So that's the study.
Thank you so much, Esteban. I've got so many I'm a historian, so I want to engage this and very much appreciate what you're trying to do here. One of the questions, of course, that emerges is how do we recover these voices that are not part of the textual evidence?
Yes.
The archaeology is part of that, and discovering some of these people. But I would love to hear more of your thoughts at some point on how we can do that. But I gave a particular compliment in my notes about your desire to understand resistance and not just outside of martyrdom,
Correct.
which the cult of the martyrs that developed in the early church, turned them into heroes and created the cult of the saints and all of this stuff. But there are other approaches, and we Christians in this century
Yes.
perhaps need to recover some of those or create some of
And
our own.
that's part of my curiosity, but I like the feedback. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Well, and we're moving along very speedily here. Thank you for both of you for staying within our time limits, which I didn't emphasize up front. Yanto, I think you're on third. Do I remember right?
Yeah.
And what time of day is it where you are at?
Uh, eight past 30.
Okay. I was
Okay.
thinking it might have even been
PM. Yeah.
later. Yeah, later in the evening. I
Yeah.
use that as an example. I really appreciate we're a global community, and what
Yeah.
the meeting of time zones often requires of students, and sometimes they're joining us in the middle of the night for some of these things. So thank you, Yanto, for having a longer day
Yeah.
here. Give me a moment to find your feedback form, and you take a moment to set up.
Wait. I cannot find the. I want to share my presentation, but I cannot find the. How
Take
to call
another
it.
moment, and we're not in as big of a hurry as we sometimes are today.
Wait.
And if we need to, we'll just change the order and have Jermaine go next and put you on alert, Jermaine, in case we need to do that.
Yeah, share. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yes, we can see it. It's not in presentation
Okay.
mode yet, but we can see it.
Okay. Yeah.
Cornelius Van Til. Oh, we're going to have fun today. Okay.
Okay. The topic of my research is about the meaning and the use of evidence in Cornelius Van Til's transcendental argument. And my research question is, what does the term evidence mean in Van Til's writing, and how does he use it in his transcendental argument? That is the research question. And my thesis, a research by John V. Fesco, reveals that that some of Van Til's students have downplayed the importance of evidence in Van Tilian apologetics. And furthermore, some individuals like J. Oliver Buswell have claimed that Van Til was anti-evidence. This paper argues that, first, evidence for Van Til's is related to historical aspect, namely the data that can be logically proven. And the second, Van Til is not anti-evidence. That is my thesis in this research. And the research methodology, I try to build an interaction as a partner of discussion with some books and articles, particularly John Fesco's Reforming Apologetics, retrieving the classic reform approach to defending the faith, and also Tom Notaro's Van Til's and the use of evidence, John Frame's Cornelius Van Til, and analysis of his thoughts, and Greg Bunsen Van Til's apologetics, readings and analysis, and other relevant books and articles. And I consider all of Van Til writings as a primary sources. And my the main point of research is the first, the meaning of evidence in Van Til's thinking and how he used it in transcendental argument. And the second point is Fesco, Notaro, and others' interpretation of the evidence in Van Til's transcendental argument. So that is the main points of my research. According to the sources I use in the study, the sources I have obtained and utilized, ranging from Van Til's own writings to secondary sources, are excellent. So the research findings are expected to be balanced, objective, and comprehensive. That is my expectation. Yeah. And the limitation of this research is, although the study of Van Til's thought is in relation to the transcendental argument for God, or TAG, falls within the realm of apologetics, Van Til's presuppositional method is inherently philosophical in nature. And consequently, this research is not limited to apologetics only, but must extend into the domain of philosophy. Given the vast scope of philosophy, great care is required, particularly regarding the use of terms and their definitions. And the results, the result of my research. First, Van Til does not reject evidence in apologetics, but his use of evidence is the opposite of those who use the evidential method, for example, Clark Pinnock and others. While evidentialist apologists present evidence to prove the existence of God, Van Til instead presupposes first that the God of the Bible exists, then invites atheists to examine the evidence, asserting that all evidence becomes intelligible when viewed or understood from a perspective that presupposes such a God. It means the God of the Christian, the Trinity God. Otherwise, from the atheist position, evidence becomes meaningless or unintelligible in the term of Van Til. Second, from what I have examined, especially Van Til's pamphlet, Why I Believe in God, under the presupposition of the existence of the Christian God, Van Til does not present a detailed and practical elucidation of how the evidence of or facts become intelligible. On the contrary, Van Til discusses more about the importance of a life that presupposes a sovereign God and how to place facts under such a presupposition so that everything appears intelligible and meaningful, instead of focusing on how to apply the transcendental argument practically by placing many evidences within it. So I mean that the focus of Van Til is how we presupposes the God of the Bible in order our life, the meaning of life, become intelligible. Yeah, something like that. The result of the last result of my research is based on the two assessments above. Assuming that evidence is unimportant for Van Til, or as some of Van Til's students argue, that evidence is unimportant in the presuppositional method, as John Fesco found in his research, is something that cannot be proven in this study. So I urge that Van Til is not anti-evidence. Van Til did use evidence, but the evidence he placed it under the presupposition of the Christian God. I think that is my presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Yanto. Boy, my goodness, I think we probably most of us in the room might have needed an introduction to Van Til before we could hang with your very deep analysis there. It's been a little while since I've grappled with his work myself. Thank you for presenting a good model of dialogue with the philosophers and demonstrating. Anyway, I would just love to know more. I'd love to hear more about how you arrived at your conclusion. But obviously, we can't do all that in the space of the time we have available here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
And I'm having a little difficulty getting your feedback form to you, but I will. In the meantime, we'll go ahead and let Jermaine get set up here. What I was struggling to find the words to say back there is that while you did this for the Imagining Formation course, in one sense, it also fits very well in the Imagining Knowing course, which is primarily epistemological. This is the question that I think has been underlying most of the debates of the past 50 years. A lot of the things we're arguing about in the church and in the world are anthropological in nature. But the reason that we're arguing is because we do not have an agreed upon or common epistemology. And we've been having this conversation as Christians with the rest of the world on the use of rationalism and the use of empiricism since the Enlightenment began. And over the past 50 years, that conversation has changed somewhat dramatically. And we need the kind of conversations that you were having there about and with Van Til. I'm curious if maybe a generation from now, there will a more distinctly Christian coherent epistemology will have arisen as a result of this. So that's a compliment that I didn't have words to say 2 minutes ago. Jermaine, are you working on your?
Yes, I think I got it now.
Okay, well, I'm still posting your feedback form here. I was too busy thinking and talking to do things at the same
Are
time.
you guys able to see my presentation? Okay.
We are.
Okay.
There is
There
some
we go.
presentation mode. Good.
There we go. And let me know when you're ready, Dr. Blair.
I think you may not have heard me. I said I'm ready. So whenever you are, Jermaine.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. I apologize. All right. Well, good morning to everyone. I know that many of us might be in different parts of America or throughout the world, so might be at a different time zone, but I am grateful to be with fellow scholars like yourself and to be able to present. One of the things that Dr. Blair talked about is that I'm focusing on a specific outcome called imagining formation for my PhD track, specifically in leadership. And I just want to give you a little bit of background as to why I'm talking about this. Imagining formation is all about expanding how we know what we know and how we imagine. Gutenberg, he expanded our access to knowledge. And so there was a really big focus on text. There was a really big focus on books, but it also narrowed our imagination of what knowledge could actually look like. And so because written text was one of the dominant forms of information in the Western world, and how we preserved information, how we organized it, and how we validated what we know, that a lot has really changed since then. So one of the things that Brueggemann advises us to do is into something that he defines as divine imagination, which is really a nice way of saying that it gives us the ability to be able to see beyond the categories that we have inherited. I want to present this thought to you that if formation is, or rather formation is bigger than information, then our sources have to be bigger than the ones that scholarship have traditionally have given us, particularly during Gutenberg's time. We also have to listen to lived experience. We have to look to relationships, communities, disruption, people's stories, and the voices of people that are being formed in real time. And so, with that in mind today, I want to talk about formation beyond competence. This is what happens when leaders reach limits of what they know how to do. They've been trained, maybe they have certificates, maybe they have a degree, whatever it may be, but they have reached the end of that. And what I have learned is that the deepest formation in a leader's life, it does not happen when everything is working. Instead, there are seasons in leadership when experience, skill, and certainty stop working. If I could say this in a more succinct way, formation often happens when what used to work no longer works anymore. And so up until this point, one of the things that I've learned is that many of us have lived with the assumption that people can become different, which is really a way that we can define formation. Most of us believe that people can change, that people can mature, that who a person is today does not mean that this is going to be who this person is going to remain tomorrow. And this is really what formation is all about. It's not simply about what I know or what I've mastered or what I can do, but formation truly is about who I am becoming. That became important to me because leadership development tends to spend enormous amounts of time on the opposite. Instead of talking about who we're becoming, oftentimes leadership development focuses on what a leader needs to know. What does a leader need to do, and what competencies does a leader need to develop? But I believe that there is a better question that we need to consider, which is who does a leader need to become? And I want to be really clear here that when we're talking about beyond competence, this is not an argument against competence. I absolutely believe that leaders need skill. I absolutely believe that leaders need training and preparation. But today is an argument that competence has its limits. And so, as we talked about, I want to talk about the problem here is when competence is not enough. Leadership development it's become very good at producing competent leaders. But when we look at the literature, we see a problem that highly competent leaders can still become destabilized when their familiar conditions or when things that they were used to as normal tend to go away. And so that raises the question that if competence was enough, why do competent leaders still collapse when the ground shifts underneath them? And so the literature suggests that, excuse me, that uncertainty almost works like an X-ray if you've ever been to a doctor. Hagbert and Gulick, they call this the wall. This is the moment when the framework that we've always used to make sense of God, that we've used to make sense of ourselves, and also the work that we do every single day, it starts to break down. It no longer holds up. And the idea that emerges is that crisis doesn't just test what we know, but it exposes who we have become. And so that's helped me to distinguish between two ideas, between functional leadership and faithful leadership. If I was to define those two, it would be, can I execute? Can I manage? Can I produce? Can I get the same result? Versus, can I remain grounded when the result disappears? Can I stay connected to mission when success is uncertain? And can I remain the person I am called to be when faithfulness becomes costly? And so here's a research question that it leaves me with. What kind of formation produces leaders who remain faithful, not merely functional in an age of uncertainty? One of the things I do want to say that as I approached this research question, there was a limitation as I approached the literature, which was that most of what it talked about, or rather how it described formation, came from the outside. And so research, they could identify stages, they could identify disorientation, they could even describe resilience and how we are able to bounce back. But really, what I wanted to approach more so was not from the outside, but instead from the inside. And so, if I can go to my thesis here, what kind of formation produces leaders who remain faithful and not merely functional in an age of uncertainty? And so, my thesis is the findings suggest that leaders experience their deepest formation in seasons of disorientation, not in spite of lost control, competence, or clarity, but instead through it. They identify what sustained them as something deeper than competence, relationships, surrender, and a mission that they remain faithful to rather than merely achieved. And so, as I began to wrestle with this, the question became, how did leaders actually experience formation through uncertainty? When we talk about phenomenology, I really felt like out of all of the research methods, this was the best one. And the reason why is wasn't so much just about what a person knew, but how, or more so, what a person actually experienced as they went through it. Frankl, in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, he had this quote where he said, "Suffering ceases to be suffering at the very moment that your suffering finds meaning." And so this wasn't a question of whether a leader went through suffering or if they were able to intellectually define what their suffering was, but if they were able to gain meaning from it. And so the question I was really asking of these leaders was, what was it like? What changed? What held in their life? What did the experience mean to them? Now, the one thing that I had to acknowledge as I went into this research was my own position, which was, if I'm really being honest, I am not neutral when it comes to this subject. The truth of the matter is, I have gone through my own seasons of challenge, my own season where it has felt like the ground has been shifting under me. And so I wanted to make sure that I did not allow my bias or my own experience to influence the research that I was doing. So this is really where bracketing mattered because I didn't want to pretend that I had no perspective. Some of the research that secondary research that I was able to lean on came from the imagination sessions. Dr. Kuntz in The Dark Knight, one of the things that she really talks about is just more so like understanding who you are. And as I listened to her presentation in The Dark Knight, it actually reminded me about something that Bonhoeffer actually talked about in his book Letters and Papers from Prison, where and I think the reason why he stood out was because everything about his life and the challenges that he went through, he literally lived out the thesis of what I'm talking about. And one of the ideas that he had was is that people don't suddenly become faithful under pressure, but instead what holds them in crisis is an allegiance that was formed before the crisis was ever formed. Dr. Blair also talked about in his imagination session about what it means when the conditions are unfavorable and yet you still have to be able to accomplish the mission. So as I approach this, and I want to make sure because I see some of my time is running out here, I did some primary research where I interviewed non-organizational leaders across four sectors. Each one of these leaders led through a significant and a sustained season of uncertainty while remaining in leadership. And so I began with the context of asking them what their leadership position was about this season where they were experiencing challenge. And then I went a little bit deeper. I asked them questions such as when did what normally worked stop working for you? What changed in how you saw yourself? What held you steady? When did you start feeling disoriented? And what happened to the mission? And the why behind the what was I wasn't so much asking what happened. That was very much going to ask context, but what I was truly asking is what was actually happening to them, which is really the question of formation. But now there are also some limits about this study here. Some of these limits that I would offer is that these leaders were looking back, and so they were recalling a lot of their information from memory. Some of this was not necessarily recent memory. In addition to this, because I was able to use a lot of my personal network, which I've been really blessed to know a lot of people in a variety of fields, these people knew me personally, and so I wanted to make sure that I acknowledge that. That being said, I was looking for various meaningful themes and assumptions in what they were saying, and so the patterns that I looked for was what kept showing up and what did these experiences rather mean to them. As I approached them, as I began to do these surveys, I want to let you know that I wasn't trying to make the interviewers necessarily agree with the leadership, but instead I wanted to see where their experiences actually confirmed what the literature actually talked about, but also where they either disagreed with it or where they complicated it. And so I didn't want them necessarily to change their story to fit the theory, but instead I wanted to see how it actually compared to what was already out there. Give me one second here. In the interviews that were analyzed, one of the things that came up consistently was that, and a lot of leaders said that competence matters, that preparation matters, that knowledge matters, that skill matters. But at the end of the day, none of those things were the things that ultimately sustained them. Instead, in seasons where control disappeared, clarity disappeared or familiarity disappeared. The things that held them mostly were the values that they had already been developed by. And so this is really what a lot of the literature talks about in The Wall and The Dark Knight, and other literature as well. The formation was very much relational. Um, they were really quick to point out that they had to learn to not be self-sufficient, but instead that they had to be able to rely on other people. And one person said something that I thought that really stuck out. They said that maturity is not independence, and they said that formation doesn't happen in isolation. But instead, that we become who we are and we become shaped and we become formed in relationship with other people. More importantly, they added another wrinkle to it that it wasn't just relationship, but it was relationship that was tied to mission. So the question wasn't just who you were in relationship with, but what are you being faithful to? And what are you being formed towards? Here, what I'll say here is, as I began this, the course really, we started by asking like, what has formed me, who has formed me, what has helped, and what has harmed. And this research has made those questions harder for me to actually answer it in a very casual way because the truth of the matter is we never actually graduate from being formed. Like we are being formed every single day by experiences, by people, and by relationship. And one of the things I'll say, if I could really say this in a succinct way, is that nobody is able to opt out of formation. So leadership development cannot only ask what competencies should we teach, but it also has to ask what kind of people are our systems producing? What relationships are surrounding our leaders? How do we help leaders process disorientation rather than simply escaping it? And what practices are shaping them? So if I'll close by saying this is that competence is extremely important. These are the things that carry us when the ground is stable. The training that we get, the education that we get, the certificates that we get, the leadership pipelines, the leadership strategy. All of it is incredibly important, and it mostly works when the ground is stable. But formation is what happens when the ground shifts. That when everything that is familiar to us, everything that we used to hold on to give us stability goes away. And so maybe the most important leadership question is not how do we make leaders more capable, but instead, who are leaders becoming when the ground begins to move? And I'm done.
Thanks so much, Jermaine. It was an excellent presentation. And it very well illustrates that point that I just made in passing at the end of Yanto's, that the chief questions of our era are anthropological, which is the nature of human personhood, and it raises all the question about how humans are then formed, and for particularly for leadership studies, which is my field, and you and I work together on this. How leaders are formed and what a difference that makes is one of the critical questions of our era. So um, you picked an excellent research method for to use to answer that kind of question. And I know the literature that you've been engaging in it. So well done. Thank you. Okay, Leah, are you ready to finish us up here this morning or evening or whatever time it is?
I'm ready. I'm ready. Let me just share my
Sure.
screen.
I'll go. Get your. My computer has slowed down here for a minute, but I think we got it. Feedback.
Yeah, this is interesting that you can give online live feedback. Yeah.
It was an experiment I started 2 years ago, and we started doing this, and it seems to work well, particularly since there's the option to give feedback afterwards. But we can't take time for the conversations, maybe face to face, but we can do so in the document, and that makes it worthwhile. Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Instructing, belonging. We see it.
You're
Looks
able to
great.
see the screen. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So first I want to say if I glitch, I apologize. I live in a very small community, so our internet can sometimes be a little shaky. But I'm really excited to share with you guys what I have kind of been looking at and talking through in the Imagining Community course. So, when I first started thinking about community for this course, I kept coming back to the question of belonging, particularly belonging across racial and cultural differences. And part of the reason for that is because my background is in sociology. I teach sociology, but I also grew up in a multiracial evangelical context. So, when I started this course, I really started to think about what it meant to construct belonging in a very meaningful way with one another. And this kind of led to my larger research question, which is how do Christian communities construct belonging across racial and cultural differences, and what determines whether those practices foster inclusion or exclusion? So essentially, I was looking at how Christian community is formed, but also who gets to form that community, who gets to determine whether it's how it's formed. Um, and what I ultimately argue is that diversity alone doesn't create belonging. So being in a church or in a congregation that has a lot of people from different backgrounds doesn't necessarily create belonging. Belonging is also shaped by what a community teaches about difference, who is represented within that community, who is able to participate within that community, and who gets to lead. So, for my research, I really wanted to think about belonging and community development through this framework of teaching, representation, participation, and leadership. And those questions kind of gave me something concrete to examine while still connecting back to the much larger question of overall belonging.
Mhm. That's good.
So the way that I did this was, well, first, I allowed the literature to kind of shift the way that I was thinking about community at first. Um, we're taught that Christian community is one body. In scripture. It talks about Christian community being a part of the household, part of the same people. The idea that in Christ, even though we may have different cultural backgrounds and come from different places, we have that shared identity and that shared community. But I also recognize that people don't enter into community culturally neutral. We bring our racial backgrounds, our culture, our histories, our traditions, and all of the assumptions that all of that carries with us when we come into these spaces to develop community. So, one of the books that really kind of helped shape my thinking about this was Miroslav Volf, Exclusion and Embrace. Vault helped me think about whether we can really create space for another person without requiring their difference to disappear in order for us to become one. And that's where I really started to think about belonging as being something different than just being in the room and being able to sit within a congregational context. But asking questions of who is able to really participate, whose differences are recognized within that context, who has a voice, who gets to lead, because all of that, I think, ultimately helps shape the collective we. It helps shape the community. So the idea that I carried from literature into research was that belonging is more than just being in the room. There's more things that we need to look at. So, what I decided to do was explore this question within my own local context. Like I said, I live in a very small community in South Georgia called Valdosta, Georgia. So I decided to look at three of our largest churches here. And I looked at these three churches for a few reasons, but the main reasons being that these are the three largest. They are really close together. So these are three churches are close to the city center. So they serve the same community. Two of these churches are on the same street within walking distance of one another. Um, and so I wanted to, and I also chose these churches because they're similar enough, but they do also have different denominational backgrounds. So Church A identifies as non-denominational, Church B identifies as Southern Baptist, and Church C identifies as Pentecostal. So I wanted to compare and see how these churches kind of interact with the community around them and how their congregations are established. The important context, though, is to also look at the broader community of Valdosta because it matters when we're looking at diversity within the congregation. Valdosta itself is approximately 55.4% Black, 33.6% white, 5.6% Hispanic or Latino, 5.4% two or more races, 1.3% Asian, 0.1% Indigenous, and then 0.2% Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander. And I felt like this was important because it showcases that these churches are not trying to construct a cohesive community through diversity, outside of something that already exists. We live in a diverse community. So diversity is something that exists outside of the church walls. So I just wanted to see if it was something that also existed within the church itself. I decided to do a comparative qualitative case study because it would allow me to ask the same questions across those three churches within the shared context of the location that we live in. I wasn't trying to determine which church was the most inclusive. I just wanted to see what they had in common or where they might differ and what those differences might tell me about how belonging is constructed within those contexts. And I wanted to look at more than what the churches had to say about themselves. So while I did compare their stated beliefs and values, I also listened to sermons and discipleship, looked at discipleship material. I looked at pathways into community ministry, leadership structures. I looked at the public representation of congregational life. So I looked at their social media pages, brochures, and things like that. And then, of course, my own observations from attending these services as well. And this just gave me a way to look across what the churches teach, what they communicate about themselves, and then what I could also observe. Okay, so the literature, particularly the work of Willie James Jennings, Miroslav Volf, Paul Herbert, and Patty Krawick raised questions about identity, difference, embrace, cultural formation, voice, and power. And that informed the analysis that I used. So it kept me coming back to questions about whether people are invited into community, how they become part of a community, and whether their differences are recognized, and then how much opportunity they have to participate and shape that community. So from those themes, I kind of saw these things develop, these six dimensions develop. Invitation, so who is welcomed in the space, integration, how people belong or brought into the community, recognition, whether they recognize racial and cultural difference, cultural expression, is there space for cultural distinction, agency, who gets to participate, serve, and lead, and then reciprocity, can different groups help shape the community? These dimensions kind of gave me a way to kind of examine all of these churches. And I looked for these dimensions through teaching, through representation, through participation, and also through leadership. This allowed me to apply kind of the same framework across these three different congregations. So the first finding that I kind of came to was that in all three congregations, um, all of the churches communicated welcome fairly broadly. They were really open. And what I mean by fairly broad is there was nothing in any of the communications, both in the church or in the public documentations that they have, public facing documents that they have, that would make people from a different background feel any kind of barrier to entry. They were all very much come as you are, you can be a part of this community. So they were really broad in that way. Where they begin to differ, though, was in how they talked about racial or cultural difference as part of their community. So, what I found was that Church A addressed racial and cultural difference very explicitly. I heard multiple sermons, both in person and through um, archived recordings that addressed racial and social division, including racial division that occurs within our local context within Valdosta, Georgia. Diversity is also part of that church's stated identity. So they identify crossing racial boundaries as a Christian work, and they use the phrase diversity without division very intentionally and very often throughout their services. Church B, their idea of belonging primarily focuses around a shared Christian identity and discipleship, but I did also find some archive teachings related to mission that did address some prejudice or thought processes people may have about different cultures. And they did also have Spanish language discipleship opportunities. In Church C, they strongly construct belonging around a shared Christian identity, but the sermons I heard, both in person and archived, focused primarily on themes of surrender, spiritual freedom, and spiritual formation, and not necessarily anything about racial or cultural difference. Um, I don't interpret the absence of that language as evidence of exclusion, but what it showed me is that these three churches just communicate they communicate welcome similarly, but they engage racial and cultural difference differently. Okay, I then moved from what the church communicated to what I could actually observe about participation. All three churches have very diverse congregations. Um, there were very diverse materials. So church pamphlets, church promotions were very diverse. When you went to the congregation, there was people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds within the congregation themselves. Um, One of the things that I thought was particularly interesting is that for Church A, the worship ministry was the most diverse. There were 9 total worship team members, 4 of which were racial minorities. Um, so that church showed the strongest visible interracial participation in worship ministry. So the next question that I looked at, excuse me, was whether that same visibility continued into formal leadership positions. And this is where the pattern of diversity kind of shifted a little bit. So across the three churches, I identified 39 formal staff positions. Only 2 were held by people who were minorities. Um, Now, this isn't to suggest that church staff should perfectly mirror the demographics of the community around them, but I do think it's an important contrast to what we noticed with the congregational difference. So racial diversity was much more visible in congregational life than it was in the formal institutional leadership. And then when I looked at the 2 staff who were minorities, what I noticed was that these staff members were a part of the worship team. So for one church, it was the worship leader, and for the other, it was the worship associate pastor. For Church C, there was no minority staff really observed, so I wasn't able to see anything there. But looking at Church A in particular and recognizing that they have a diverse worship team, um, it made me think if maybe the diverse worship team was connected to the worship leadership being a part of a minority group. And so it just made me think if representative leadership influences who participates. And it's a question that I want to maybe further look into, but I thought it was something that was interesting. So when I put the literature together with these findings, I found it helpful to think about belonging through 5 different layers. Presence, so who is in the room, participation, who serves and participates, voice, whose difference is recognized, leadership, who helps guide the community, and authority, who helps determine what the community becomes. I'm not suggesting that these are stages that people have to move through in order to belong, but they're ways of thinking about what I was seeing in the data because racial diversity, I recognized, was very visible at one layer and not visible at another. And so it brought me back to Wolf and the idea of embrace, which is making space for the other without requiring difference. And I started to wonder if making space is enough. Does the person we've made room for or made space for in a community simply have a place in a community that's already constructed? Or can their presence and perspective actually help shape what the community becomes. And I think that's probably the biggest shift in my thinking that came out of this research. Like I said, all of these congregations were diverse, but the leadership, those who kind of have the authority to construct what belonging means, was not. And so I just thought that was interesting and possible place for further study. So again, across these congregations, Christian belonging is constructed through welcome. It's very broad. All three have very meaningful structures of belonging, but where they differ is how intentionally racial and cultural difference is recognized and incorporated. Um, and so I'm not concluding that belonging is absent from these churches. What I am concluding is that belonging across difference asks us to look beyond who is just welcomed into the church, but it also raises questions about who participates, whose voice is heard, who gets to lead, and who has the opportunities to help shape the community. Now, there are limitations here. This is a very small study. I live in a small community. This is not representative of all of South Georgia. This is just what I found locally. I also was only looking at how belonging is constructed institutionally and not necessarily individual experiences of belonging. So, one of the most important distinctions for me is that institutional construction of belonging does not necessarily equal lived experience of belonging in community. And that could possibly be a place for further research is to look at how these experiences lead to an individual experience of belonging. These are the primary congregational materials, the research sources, and the contextual data that informed my research. But I wanted to end with the question that I'm leaving this research with. So I started by asking how Christian communities construct belonging across racial and cultural differences. And I think I'm leaving with kind of thinking when we say someone belongs to us as a part of a Christian community, do we simply mean they have a place within the community that has already been constructed? Or are we saying that belonging means they can participate in shaping the collective we in some way? I don't think that this answered the question completely, but I think it gave me a much clearer understanding of why that is a question that is worth asking.
Thanks, Leah. Fascinating study. I see some applauding here. The kind of questions we have very obviously need to be asking in our generation. And this may not be yours to study, but I did put it. Maybe I didn't even write this in yet. But I think one of the related questions that somebody ought to take up is we have, at least in our cultural context, because of the fact that the dominant church culture had not been necessarily inclusive for so long, we have an awful lot of congregations that are established around particular ethnic groups, minorities that are largely exclusive to that group. What does this kind of pattern mean for those kind of congregations then? And you would be in far better place to be able to study that than I would be. So I would love to see that study at some point. Maybe somebody's out there doing it. I'm not really up to date with the sociological literature, but there's some really, really good stuff here. All of you, this is one of the things every time we have one of these presentations, one of these meetings, I am impressed with the quality of work that everybody's doing. Some of it is very beginning lab stages. It's interesting to see after 4 presentations how the confidence level and the quality of the work has increased in many cases. But you're all doing things that matter, and I hear some passion in the way that you're presenting it because you know it matters and it matters to you. And we're learning the scholarly methods of research, or we're practicing the things that we know, and these are supposed to be intended to be small research projects, so we're not expecting any kind of grandiose conclusions. But if it contributes to your own calling a little bit and your own passions, if it builds into a dissertation, if it becomes something that you have to offer the wider church eventually as a result of your good work here, amen and hallelujah. Just want to encourage you in that. Delighted with not just what you do, but who you are in the doing of it. So thank you for that. It looks like we did have a recording that is still recording. So what I will do is post that probably before the end of the day. Zoom will take a little while to process, and it takes me about an hour to load everything into YouTube. So we'll get to that a little bit later and link that so that it's available. Your choice then would be to say, do I give this recording to my mentor team as part of my portfolio as is, or has the feedback that I've received caused me to change some things? And if you do any revisions or refinements, you can decide, you and your mentor team can decide in what version, whether you re-record it or you simply talk it through with them or you give them some other kind of deliverable of your work. But that's between you and your mentor team. We always regard this as kind of the initial draft and for first attempt, and then take it for what it's worth. And if the feedback is not helpful or doesn't quite get the gist of it, that's okay too. None of us are expert in all these fields, so we're just giving what we can give. All good? Any questions? Okay. Blessings on you all. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Or evening, as the case may be. Thanks.